Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we've always said, we're bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
I like the sound of my own voice, funny enough.
Guys, we're already started having some fun. Welcome back to the Low Carb MD podcast. Brian Lenskis, Dr. Brian Lenskis is going to miss this. He's going to be upset that he missed this, okay, because we really have a special guest today. You may have not have heard. Maybe you've lived under a rock for the last 20 years. Maybe you've lived under a rock for the last 50 years, and you don't know that ketogenic diets have randomized controlled trials demonstrating their efficacy in migraine headaches and cluster headaches and seizures. Maybe you didn't know that. Maybe you were like me 5 years ago, you didn't know that. And so maybe you've lived under a rock. And if you have been living under a rock, well, we have the right guest for you today. Somebody who's an expert on migraines, somebody who's an expert on seizures and neurologic conditions, a doctor, a physician entrepreneur, and a very special guest today, Kristen. I am so
hello.
Very happy to have you as a co-host today. You know, finally we got some younger, fresher blood here. We got Brian out of the way. So happy to have you here co-hosting with me. How are you doing? Tell me what's going on.
I'm good. Brian and I are getting busy at our new clinic, Low Carb MD San Diego. So it's great to take a little break and get a podcast in this morning with our wonderful guest, Dr. Josh Turknett, who I am thrilled to have on because he was one of the first people who introduced me to a ketogenic diet when I was seeking relief for almost daily chronic migraines. I read his book, his first book, I should say, The Migraine Miracle, which is the first time I ever heard of the ketogenic diet, and it completely transformed my life. So I'm forever grateful for him and super excited to have him on. Dr. Turknett graduated from Emory University School of Medicine, then did a residency in neurology at University of Florida. He actually has two books out. I mentioned The Migraine Miracle and his new book that just came out a couple months ago, Keto for Migraine. So Josh Turknett, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me and for that great introduction.
Of course, you're one of my heroes. So why don't you tell our audience how you stumbled upon a ketogenic diet for migraines and some of the work that you do around it?
Yeah, sure. So it's been a long story now. It's been about 10 years since this whole journey began for me. So probably like a lot of fellow colleagues, in medicine, I got out of residency, was doing my practice, really didn't have much in the way of an understanding of nutrition, certainly didn't have much in the way of familiarity with low carb diets and that sort of thing. Did have some background with the ketogenic diet specifically for epilepsy, but it wasn't until 2010 when pretty much just some random internet surfing, led me in my first foray into this world. I don't know if either of you are familiar with Kurt Harris, but he's a radiologist who wrote a bunch about paleo and low carb, about 10 years ago. Really good stuff, and that's what I first stumbled upon. And that actually led to reading Gary Taubes's Good Calories, Bad Calories, which Harris had recommended, which kind of shattered my world. Here was this, all these ideas kind of that I'd held as facts about health and nutrition, about fat and cholesterol that, had not really been validated, subject to scientific scrutiny. So clearly, I had a lot to learn. And so that led me into sort of the next, basically that started something that continues to this day. But it led to me doing sort of a whole bunch of personal research, really led me to the field of ancestral health, which is kind of what sort of the I guess, more medical arm of the paleo movement evolved into. And that, ultimately I reached a point where I had this level of knowledge that I'd built up that was sort of that contradicted the things that I was doing in my own life, right? In terms of what I'd understood. Not that I was like a health nut or anything, but I did things to try what I thought was a reasonably healthy diet and lifestyle. And there were now things that I felt like were completely out of line with that. So the first thing was I just changed what I was doing. And that included inadvertently at the time, going keto. So I, dropped my carbohydrates considerably, pretty much just changing the food quality of my diet, but also having an awareness for, for carbohydrates that I didn't have before. And what happened was, so first of all, as I'm sure you guys know, many of your listeners know, that the first thing that happened was I started feeling great in so many different ways. I started, my energy levels were much better. I was thinking more clearly, all these wonderful things, and which, alone were kind of proof enough of the concept. But then it was about 6 weeks into it, and I still remember exactly where I was when I realized this, because I said, it suddenly dawned on me, I haven't had a headache since I started doing this. And I am a, longtime migraine sufferer myself. Mine started when I was a teenager, started steadily worsening over the years. By the time I was practicing, this was, at the time of this, I was in my early to mid 30s, and probably having to take prescription medication for migraines about 60 times a year. And then sort of more low-level headaches in between those. Doing that to still be able to function as a physician and father and husband and so forth. So to go from that to here I am 6 weeks into it, and I can't recall the last time I took anything. I called my wife right then. I said, this is crazy, but since I started doing this, I haven't had a migraine. And I thought, is this real? Could this really be true? And if of course, the irony of this being, here I am, a neurologist with special expertise in migraine. I've researched everything. I've do clinical research in migraine, do clinical trials. And I have available to me everything, all the best that modern medicine has to offer. And yet here I'd inadvertently, through this change in my diet, had stumbled upon something that was, far better than anything I'd ever had before. So, first I was like cautiously optimistic, right? And then I kept on, waiting and seeing, continuing with eating this way. And in that entire first year, I had one migraine for where I took something. And that was on an anniversary dinner where I cheated on the diet, not my wife. And so during that process, after realizing, holy cow, began, exploring whether or not other migraineurs had this experience, and in both kind of the low carb communities and the paleo communities. And the answer was yes. This was a experience that many others had. And in fact, actually, that if you look back in the literature, there are reports of keto helping for migraine in the early 20th century. But all that, was just lost, that whole area. But again, began realizing this is not just, this is working not just for me, but for others who are doing the same thing. So that's when I began taking it with patients, realizing that it's working there. And that led to me saying, I can't just sit on this information as a neurologist and migraineur. I have to get this out there in some way, shape, or form to the people who need it, because, this is better than anything I've seen. It can transform people's lives. And that's what led me to end up writing the book, which was published in 2013. And back then, if you had, the book there was covering an ancestral approach to migraines. And, a big part of that being eliminating refined carbohydrates, moving towards an evolutionarily appropriate diet. So significant carbohydrate restriction, talk about keto in that book as well. And at that time, nobody knew the word keto. Nobody knew ketogenic. The only people who would have not known related to it were fellow neurologists who, had used it in the context of epilepsy. But, even then my colleagues wouldn't have known the word, certainly nobody out. But so the amount, just think back to just how short a time ago that was, and now to see what has happened with it is pretty incredible, which I think is encouraging. So yeah, that's I guess that's the short version of the story of how I ended up, in this world and still in this world.
It's interesting that you bring it up. I feel like medicine has just suffered this, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie Memento, where we just constantly lose short-term memory. We're constant because, like you said, dating back to the early 20th century, we had evidence that lower carbohydrate approaches improved headaches. Yudkin mentioned it. Atkins definitely mentioned it. And it's like, it just keeps coming back. And if you look at the literature, as far back as, there were studies on Atkins for ketogenic diet or cluster headaches or the association of macronutrients on headaches. Certainly in 2012, I was able to find a study on headaches and lower carbohydrate approaches. And since then, I mean, it's full, the literature is full of studies, even randomized, like double-blind studies
right.
For migraine headaches. So it's like we just keep forgetting, like people were observing this, and it's somehow, I don't know how we just keep forgetting, and it's tragic.
Yeah,
tragic. So what do you think about this? I'm just curious, what bit of evidence? So you're probably, very evidence-based and evidence-oriented. You're a migraine specialist. You experienced personal kind of improvement, and I can relate to that. At what point were you like, okay, the evidence is so compelling that I have to recommend this, I have to write a book? What help me understand that leap right there?
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, first of all, after having used it with enough people to know, personally that it was effective, and in my own clinical experience, it's like, we love to have randomized controlled trials for things, right? But most of the knowledge we have about the world, we've acquired through sort of this empirical trial and error approach, including most things that doctors do, right? There are very few patients that we treat that actually fit nicely into any particular trial. So we're always using our judgment. We're always using the knowledge that we've constructed over years of practice and experience. And if you think about all the things that we think of to stay healthy, most of those we just acquired through our own experience. We need to drink water every day. We figured that out. There's a whole cluster of knowledge. So it became, with that, clearly based on my experience, this was more powerful than anything that I'd seen before. The only other question at that point becomes, is this safe? Is there any concern that this would be, they need to be vetted from a safety standpoint? Well, we already have that. We've got trials from the epilepsy data that clearly show that long-term ketogenic diets are fine. And then we also have the fact that, if we had just taken an evolutionary lens on this from the beginning, we as humans have probably been in ketosis for significant parts of our lives throughout human evolution, simply based on the seasonal availability of certain foods. So this is a metabolic state that's probably, where it probably have been in more than any other. So there would be no reason from an evolutionary standpoint to think, there's any problem with this. But the reason, you talk about repeating the same mistakes, which we've done, right? We've discovered that this is beneficial over and over and over again. And there are probably many reasons why we keep forgetting this. But one of the big things that happened, from the turn of the century, when you had all this interest and evidence accumulating for ketogenic diets as a therapeutic tool, and then you have the vilification of fat and saturated fat in particular. So it becomes this, extreme diet in many people's minds because it requires increasing fat content in the diet, compared to what the typical person is eating. And once that happened, it kind of shut down the whole field for a long time. Probably, you throw into the mix the fact that diet and lifestyle interventions are not moneymakers. So, you have a whole pharmaceutical industry that's looking for drug cures for conditions. So, the ketogenic diet's not sexy from that standpoint. So you have, I think, those forces, two of those forces at play, sort of our desire to find the silver bullet, and then the vilification of fat that led it to be, marginalized. So once you come to the realization of those forces, and you realize this is not anything to be feared. This is a perfectly normal metabolic state, and it has all these incredible benefits. There's really no reason to keep that information to myself, right?
Right. And you know what is interesting in the papers I've read, it sounds like we haven't really nailed down the mechanism behind why a ketogenic diet works. It's thought to be complex and multifactorial. Maybe it's from inhibition of the NLRP3 inflammasome. Maybe it's the ketone's property as signaling molecules or modulating some of the neurotransmitters. As far as your research has concluded, what do you think are the most prominent mechanisms behind ketogenic diets working for not only migraines, but we have it with epilepsy, and there's research coming out in the neurological field that you study too with Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. Right.
Yes. So there are probably many potential mechanisms by which it works, right? And so which ones of those, are the real mechanism? It's uncertain. Almost certainly it's going to be not just any one thing, but a whole multitude of things that happen. So, I mean, if you think about what's happening during someone transitioning from a standard Western diet to a ketogenic diet, right? There are so many changes happening, both sort of behaviorally and metabolically, that, it would be mind-boggling to try to characterize each and every one of those. And they're probably all relevant, and they're probably all interacting in ways that we still can't even model, that are so complex. So it's a challenge to say, but that again is why it's so powerful, right? You're taking an intervention that impacts everything, right? And it's something that we have been evolved to handle and to deal with for millions of years. So all that is why, it's so powerful. But then being able to take all that and say, here's the smoking gun, this is why it works. But so there are two, I tend to think of it divided into two possible categories of why it's working. One is what are the ketones doing, right, as a potential mechanism? And the other is, what are you taking away by doing this? So there's all sorts of things that you're taking away that are potentially harmful, right, that, when you're moving to keto. Number one being added sugar in the diet. So that alone is going to be accounting for significant amounts of the benefit. And you could conceivably argue that that most of the benefits are accruing not from the ketones themselves, but from other ancillary effects that are occurring when you're going keto. But there are physiological mechanisms, plausible physiological mechanisms. You mentioned one by which ketones would be beneficial, in particular for things like epilepsy and things like migraine, based on what we understand of their pathophysiology. There's evidence that there's increase in inhibitory neurotransmitters and reduction of excitatory neurotransmitters with keto, and that could potentially be helpful for both migraine and epilepsy. Both of those are kind of broadly categorized as conditions of hyperexcitability in the brain. So those factors would tend to reduce the amount of excitation. Probably my favorite potential mechanism for migraine is there is evidence that suggesting that migraine could be a homeostatic reaction to increase oxidative injury. So you have, and there's a, good evidence indicating that for a variety of reasons, when you're in ketosis, there is a reduction in oxidative damage. So you're generating fewer reactive oxygen species, and you're also upregulating the defenses against those. And so that's a nice connection between between migraine, which there's evidence suggesting that in migraineurs, that migraines themselves occur in the setting of increased oxidative injury. So that's a nice way to connect those two. But I think overall, I think one of the shortcomings in medicine in general is that and the whole discussion as to why this probably is, but we want to have a mechanistic explanation in order to be able to advocate for something. And that has come from primarily looking for treatments for single variable conditions, where you can actually treat that with a single variable intervention like a drug. And so in that case, you want to find, this is the mechanism, that's the target, that's the molecular target, we're going to go after it. So all of our research, and even the way we're taught, is to think mechanistically, and then with the idea being that's going to lead to our treatment. When you have complex chronic conditions like migraine, and like pretty much everything we see in the medical clinic today, all of the chronic diseases, these are not single variable conditions. They are the pathophysiology is extraordinarily complex. It's going to involve, gajillions of molecules. We're not going to have one single mechanism to explain it. So how do you go about, treating something like that? And that's where having an empirical approach to just finding out what works and actually building in research systems that can evaluate that is so important. It's not something we've been doing in medicine. And to me, that's one of the big reasons why our therapeutic progress has been so limited, especially in chronic diseases. We're still looking for a smoking gun mechanistically so we can go after that with a single drug. And the conditions we see are just not amenable to that approach. So I think we need to, and that's what, lifestyle interventions are. They are multivariate interventions that sort of impact all these different physiological processes. That's not something that's easily studied in a randomized trial. It's not the right format for it, even though we still push for that because that has become the only way we can kind of validate new therapies. But one of the things I argue for is a new model for a new research ecosystem for being able to just figure out what works, which will then lead us to explore possible mechanisms of why. But we need to dissociate the figuring out why it works from figuring out what works.
Yeah, I think one of the problems you're alluding to, and I think this is tough for the average listener to understand, is, guys, you have to understand when you're getting the reason why people want to understand the mechanism, the exact mechanism, right, is because they want to isolate it, mass produce it, and patent it and put it into a trial.
Right.
This is the way that our regulatory system is set up. You have to find something in preclinical studies, patent it, and then go ahead and test it in phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. And this is the problem, okay, that makes it very challenging for diet, because really nobody can make money off of diet, right? So who's going to pay for all of that research to put that into a clinical trial? And so it relies on observation. You're absolutely right. I agree with you, Josh. It's like, observation is so critical. But here's the thing. In migraines, we have the studies. Di Lorenzo done them. Atkins, it started really with Atkins. And when Atkins noted that significant improvement in headaches, and then people started to pay attention. And I think in 2012 or 13, really the trials for low carb, modified Atkins really started to come out. And then, at this point we have randomized trials with low carb diets, improving migraines and cluster headaches that are undeniable in terms of their efficacy. So now, and with minimal, with the side effect being that you have to get a new wardrobe. So, but here's the thing, that took people's time, that took money, that took passion. Nobody's going to sponsor that. And I know DiLorenzo's done a lot of that work. And we're very grateful for researchers like that who've kind of pushed it. You and I, we rely on our observations, right? We have enough clinical know-how, and we kind of just get an idea of what works. But they've pushed this stuff into the literature, and we're ever thankful for them. And we're trying to do that too. My question for you is this, okay? So there was this study that I wanted to get your take on it, in mice, okay, that showed that if you eradicate the microbiome, a ketogenic diet loses its seizure prevention powers. What do you think about the relationship? I don't know if you ever saw that study, or do you think some of this, we talked about the fact that we're eliminating reactive oxygen species by lowering our sugar. We talked about the ketones potentially having a neuroinhibitory effect. I've always viewed microbiome as like this magical fairyland place. Do you think, but I'm starting to be a little bit more open to the idea that maybe it's a role here. What do you think about microbiome and the neurologic impact, that gut-brain axis? Is it hocus pocus? Is it something that needs more research? What should the average listener think?
So it's a great question. And I think the biggest takeaway from the research that's been done on the microbiome, over the past decade or so, is that it's super important, and it's far more important than we realized, right? And that so it probably impacts every aspect of our health. Now, the other question, and that sort of has led to people wanting to take that information and do something about it, right? We want to figure out how to then promote the best gut bugs possible. But there's, like you said, there's lots more research that needs to be done for us to really have a firm handle on what that looks like, much less figure out how we can influence that in an intelligent way. So, and there's clearly a big connection between not just the microbiome, but the gut in general, and neurological function and migraine. So there's a strong connection between multiple different conditions that involve the gut. So like inflammatory bowel disease, celiac, where you have compromised gut health, and you see an increased incidence of migraines. And so I think there's clearly the connection there. Part of that is likely mediated through changes in the microbiome, but then you also have gut bugs that are involved in neurotransmitter synthesis, and surely that's relevant. So it is a super complex thing, and we're still super early in understanding it. And I'm familiar with that. I remember reading that study a while back that you talked about, which is super intriguing. You eliminate the microbiome, and then you lose the ketogenic effects. So clearly it is involved in the pathway in some way, right? It's probably not the only thing there, but it may be a necessary condition, right? That for it to work. And why that is, we don't know yet. But it speaks to just the importance of the microbiome, the importance of the gut, and how integrated it is, and how everything is integrated, right? I think this is another limitation of modern medicine is how siloed we've all become, and have lost sort of seeing the body as this one big interconnected system where you really can't tease out one part from another. And if you're going to change one thing, you're going to change everything. And we still don't know really anything about if you're making specific changes to the microbiome, what are all the ramifications of that. But the takeaway is it's super important, so we should care about it. So we should be thinking about what are the things, sort of behavioral, lifestyle, and diet-wise, that we can be doing to promote, what we think of as a healthy microbiome. And this is another place where kind of using an ancestral template to look at that to me is most helpful in terms of defining what the foundation of that should be.
Yeah, because the alternate side is we've looked at like probiotic supplements, and they don't really do much.
No.
That's great. The microbiome's like important. Maybe it's integral in that pathway to prevent seizures, at least in mice. Maybe it's integral in that pathway to prevent migraines. But we don't know what the hell to do with that. And certainly we know that the probiotics don't work and don't do all that much, at least the ones in a pill.
Right.
So yeah, like you're left with nothing actionable.
That's the challenge with when you find new research areas that are extremely promising, and it's like, where's the commercial opportunity? And people are going to seize on that. And so then you have the whole probiotic thing, and people hear the microbiome's important, so that might as well, I should buy this. But yet there's like you said, the evidence isn't great, and probably one of the biggest reasons why is that just taking a probiotic doesn't necessarily do anything to changing your microbiome. It's like a garden, and you just scatter a few seeds and hope for the best.
With epilepsy, I know with ketogenic diets, you aim for a specific ratio of fat to protein and carbs, if it's 4-to-1 or 3-to-1. Have you found the sweet spot with migraines, or is there a little bit more flexibility for people who are suffering? Do you have a recommended amount of macros they should aim for in their diet?
So I generally don't. I have found, so this was something that, initially I was advising certain macro ratios. And I found that overall, the benefits of that were limited, but it oftentimes led people to obsess too much about the details of their diet. And so they would, we can only focus on so many things. So, helping them know what to best focus on is really important in this process. So I just advocate people to start with a general template, a general framework for the foods to choose from. And usually just doing that, they will, see tremendous improvements, just experientially, which is really all they care about. But B, also produce ketones. So the only place where I really then, if someone has been doing it for a while, not producing ketones and not feeling better, right? Then we can dig into like adjusting some ratios and, just seeing if there maybe, the protein's too high and so forth. But I haven't found clinically for it to matter. And also doesn't seem that the depth of ketosis matters too much in terms of its protective benefits for migraine. And again, probably just speaks to the fact that there are so many variables involved here, the ketones being one of them. So that's, maybe why the depth isn't as important for them. And we built this online community of people several years ago. And with that, every few months, we would have a cohort of people do a ketogenic diet. I call it the Keto Blast. And this is doing this over and over again is where we learned a lot of these things, seeing multiple people go through it, what their experiences were, and learned a lot about, how to best implement it for a migraineur. And that was actually what led to the second book, where I said, here's all this stuff we've accumulated, this experiential knowledge about what's helpful for a migraineur implementing keto. It's not out there, so write this and put it in a book.
Yeah, and you also have a podcast dedicated to keto for migraines or migraines in general.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's called the Migraine Miracle Moment. The first book was the Migraine Miracles, so that's where it comes. So yeah, I imagine there are podcast fans out there. So
yes, another thing I wanted to kind of pick your brain with is Alzheimer's. There's a lot of talk about ketogenic diet, not only for treatment of Alzheimer's, but a potential role in prevention. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think, first of all, the literature is very exciting about Alzheimer's and neurodegenerative disorders in general. And again, of course, we want to figure out why that is. So first of all, I would say that I generally advocate to patients, friends, and families that going into keto periodically, cycling in and out of it as a health strategy, partly for potential prevention against neurodegenerative disorders and Alzheimer's in particular. So, bottom line is that I think there's enough to be convinced that there's a role here, and that it's doing something, and that there's benefit in terms of prevention. And it may well be that it's actually more powerful as a preventative mechanism than it is for therapeutically. That you may see therapeutic benefits, but probably the best time to start doing it would be early. And then, so mechanistically, there are, again, many potential reasons, but from a prevention standpoint, the pathological signatures of so many of these neurodegenerative disorders are the accumulation of sort of metabolic waste products, right? So you have this, I use the analogy of this just trash building up, and you have more trash building up each day than you can eliminate. And so, you can influence that process by making less trash, or by upregulating your, hiring more trash collectors. And so that, we know that like one of the recent exciting things that has developed in neurology is we've discovered there's this whole glymphatic system in the brain that's involved with clearing out, toxins, and it happens when we sleep. Now there's a potential connection, but why we see sleep disorders and a strong connection between Alzheimer's disease. So there you have, less metabolic cleanup over time. But on the other end, if you want to reduce the trash, ketogenic diets, a brain on ketosis is generating less metabolic waste than a brain running on sugar. So that again is one potential mechanism that kind of ties a lot of the findings together. But regardless of whether we know why, I think there's enough to say, no downside and potentially big upside. So cycling in and out makes sense if you care about protecting your brain over the long term.
Have you faced criticism from colleagues regarding your kind of more of an ancestral approach regarding, supporting now there's some data for certainly for seizures there was data. Now there's significant data for migraines. But your book came out, 8 years ago, and
yeah.
And much of the data came out after that. Did you face pushback, criticism? Yeah, I'm just curious. Kind of, did you ever experience any of that stuff?
Not too much. There are a few things with that. It's not necessarily that I wouldn't if you're encountering the right person. So. Probably the biggest issue initially with anyone promoting a ketogenic diet in a clinical setting was that many people, years when I was first doing this, would have equated keto with ketoacidosis and thought it was dangerous and said you can't do that. I think finally it's become prominent enough that people aren't making that mistake anymore. But one really encouraging thing has been that many of the people that we've helped with this have then taken it to their doctors and said, here's this book I read. Here's what it advocates, and my migraines are way better. And, I just wanted you to know about it, and maybe you could share it with others. And by and large, the overwhelming reception to that has been really positive. And I think that, and this gets kind of philosophically back to my own approach with trying to spread this whole message, both within the public sphere, but also internally in the field of medicine, is that it's far more powerful results speak for themselves. So when you have a patient come in who, you've been struggling to treat for years with some, really challenging condition, no doctor likes to treat chronic migraines because they feel like a failure. Right. And you want to help them. So you have somebody coming in that you've been this patient, you see them again, you're like, oh, what do I have left for them? I don't want to have this conversation again because I don't have anything, but I have to, still be their doctor. And then they come in and say, look, I'm better. I'm doing better. And they're like, relieved, they're not going to push back on that. And they're going to be more likely to spread that. So I feel like the fastest way to change is this bottom-up approach. You know, is if you can just get the word out. That was another reason for writing the book. Is that if I knew I'd get the word out, I could get people to put this into action, they'd get results. The results would speak for themselves, you know, personally, but also to others who might otherwise take issue. Versus, you know, you present it at a conference and you have, oh, well, it's, you know, you have all the objections about, you know, it's ketogenic and whatever. So, you know, I've found that to be an encouraging phenomenon, and I think that the bottom-up approach is the winning one here.
With migraines too, you mentioned earlier, you know, everything's multifactorial, and sometimes what you're omitting is just as important. What are your thoughts on caffeine for migraine sufferers?
Yeah, that's a tricky topic. It's tricky because caffeine can be helpful and it can be harmful. And it's often, one of the things that I try to get migraineurs to help them understand is that what things that we can do that might bring on a migraine and things that we can do once a migraine exists may have very different impacts. So the issue with caffeine is that it can be a trigger, and it can also help once the migraine has occurred, which is hard for people to wrap their minds around. But it's, you know, you're in two different physiological states in that situation. So that's, you know, that it's not, it seems paradoxical, but it's not. So I personally, most migraineurs would be better off without any caffeine, especially if they're struggling. But I personally enjoy coffee, and I enjoy the productivity boost that I get from it. And I also think there are beneficial compounds in coffee that are, you know, that can promote better health. So I've tried to find a balance, and I think that it's possible to find that balance. And so what I generally recommend for folks who are trying to maintain, you know, some level of caffeine, first of all, moderation, you know, don't go nuts with it. But what seems to matter the most is the time of day. So caffeine in the morning seems to be much less problematic than caffeine, you know, after like 2 o'clock, which makes sense in that in one sense, you're sort of amplifying circadian rhythm. You know, your body's trying to alert itself. And if you're drinking in the morning, then you're kind of supporting that process. Whereas if you're drinking in the afternoon, or if you're drinking it because you're getting tired and you want to stay awake, those are the scenarios where it becomes problematic for the migraineur. And so generally what I recommend, you know, more, if you're going to do it before noon, 1 to 2 cups, you know, and don't go overboard. But if you have it and you're still struggling, then it's something that sometimes it's worth eliminating for a period of time and then possibly reintroducing later.
You know, one of the things, you know, it's funny, migraines, and sometimes I lump migraines in with chronic pain, and I lump that in together with medically unexplained symptoms sometimes, right?
Right.
These together, especially you can probably appreciate that if you've ever, you know, dealing with chronic pain, the people, chronic migraines who may not get any resolution from anything that you throw at them. And me being a chronic kind of pain sufferer, let me tell you, if I sleep poorly, it's back. It's out.
Yes.
I relate to the migraine sufferers, my wife being one of those. If I have stress, oh my God, it's much worse. Mm-hmm. Right? So sleep, stress kind of exacerbate it, and certainly diet exacerbates it. I can tell you that, you know.
Right.
And so I relate chronic pain in general, chronic musculoskeletal pain, and chronic migraines, and even diet. We've noticed that people sleep poorly, and diabetes and glycemia, right? We've seen that they all respond poorly to stress and sleep deprivation and kind of overall mental health, right? Mm-hmm. If the mental health is poor. So which is the chicken and which is the egg? Is the stress, sleep, and the mental health stuff the chicken, or is it the egg? Because I believe it's like, I believe it's the cause. I believe that stuff causes the migraines.
Well,
Imagine somebody being in Tahiti with a great diet and like, you know, and maybe they do get chronic migraines, but certainly I can't imagine it getting worse.
yeah, no,
Help me
so
understand those. You know?
I think you're right. I mean, so I think the best frame for understanding migraines and understanding most of the chronic diseases that now we all with doctors see these days is that they're mismatch phenomena. So they only arise in context in which our present environment is mismatched to our evolutionary habitat. And the greater the degree of that mismatch, the more, more likely these things are to occur. So, I don't think it's coincidental that there aren't reports, of migraines in indigenous populations, just like there's extraordinarily low incidence of diabetes and obesity and Alzheimer's and these sorts of things. So we only see these particular conditions emerge in the context of modern diets and lifestyle. And then we also, lo and behold, find that the best way to treat them is to remove all those mismatches. So I think, yes, you're absolutely right that you have these, sleep is a huge one, right? That's a big mismatch between how we are today and how we used to live, and within that sort of our circadian rhythms and our circadian alignment. And then stress being another huge one, right? Psychological stress that is common these days. So you have all of these things that then, ultimately impact our physiology in ways that then render us susceptible to these conditions. And, there's, I think, evidence to think that perhaps the role genes play is that they drive what particular manifestation of mismatch you're going to experience, whether or not that's diabetes, or whether or not it leads to cancer, or whether or not it leads to migraines. That may be, driven in part by genetics, but the sort of the unifying factor there is mismatch. And, relevant to this podcast, one of the biggest mismatches is our diet, and in particular our consumption of carbohydrates and refined carbohydrates. So, another prominent mismatch that we see dramatic improvements in health once you address it. So yeah, I think, I don't know which is right to say, chicken or egg, but it's yes.
Well, I'll talk about that a little bit as it relates to migraines, because I've seen studies as far back as like the 2000s that looked at the association. Okay, now we have double-blind, studies with ketogenic diets and improving outcomes, right? Outcomes for chronic migraine sufferers.
Right.
But look back at, these are the issues that relate to diet and exacerbation of migraines. Guess what you'll find? Red meat worsens migraines, associated with worsening migraines. White meat associated with worsening migraines, okay? Saturated fat associated with worsening migraines. This is before we had the interventional data.
Right. Right.
So help me understand, how is like a curious doctor supposed to reconcile these two? I mean, look, we watched it unfold, right?
Yeah.
Association data said this stuff is bad for migraines. And now we have the last 10 years interventional trial data showing that ketogenic, low carb, modified Atkins all improves migraines, cluster headaches, and chronic headaches. So what do you say to that?
I would say that if there's any lesson we've learned in the past half century, is that we should stop making any clinical decisions based on nutritional epidemiological studies. That if you are
Kristen, what do you think about that? I mean, because you suffered from migraines for a long, long time, right? And
I did, yeah.
You did a diet. What's your take on that? Because that was the data that existed. It's associated with worsening migraines. Well, if you eat more, you'll be fine.
Yeah, go ahead.
So interestingly, I never had migraines or headaches really until I became vegan, and I was vegan in an effort to control my lupus symptoms. And I'll say my lupus got worse being vegan, and I developed migraines where I was on 4 different preventative medications. So when I started eating meat, my migraines went away. My lupus symptoms got better. It's just an N=1 experience. And I think, again, the epidemiology and associations, they give us a good place to start planning for more interventional type trials, but correlation is not causation there.
Yeah, and there are epidemiological trials, or at least retrospective trials, showing increased headaches in vegetarians. I mean, increased migraines in vegetarians. So, I mean, just like that's the whole message of nutritional epidemiology. You can find something to support any contention, which is why we're in the place we are in the world of nutrition anyways, is that we've relied on that as our data. So anybody can support any particular position by just cherry picking what they want.
So
it's so true.
We have 3 physician entrepreneurs here. So I want to just segue a little bit into, kind of breaking the molds of conventional doctors. So can you talk about physician entrepreneurship and how that's affected your life, and kind of what are the things that you're doing now that you have a new book coming out. So
yeah.
I'm just curious, let's take a second and talk about not caging us doctors into a 10 by 10 room with a Welsh-Allen ophthalmoscope on the wall. What how are you doing? What does the future hold for you? And can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a great topic. I think I would love to see a rise in more physician entrepreneurs. I think the biggest thing that holds physicians back is what's the sunk cost fallacy, which is that, you've put all this time and resources and energy into building this particular career, and you feel like if you're going to do anything else, you're losing that. It's called a fallacy because it's a logical fallacy, but it's really, really powerful. So I think that's one reason a lot of doctors end up staying. But for me, and I think probably every human, most of us aren't cut out to do the same thing day in and day out for 40 years. So, being able to, so I think if we want to kind of create the most fulfilling life possible, then having that flexibility to do other things when the opportunities arise or when our interests change, I think is really important just for mental health and well-being. I'm sure we all know how many really burned out doctors do you know who've been doing this for 20, 30 years, or just going through the motions, but not really opening to the possibility that there are more things out there. So that's the big picture, of the whole idea.
What's that? World-renowned neurologist. What are the other things you do right now? What are the other things that are coming up?
Yeah. So so the first thing I did was the book, and then that led to starting an online community of people who are putting this program into action. So that's led to a website, a podcast, a membership community. So I devote a lot of my energy to that now. And that arose because I realized this information, I can't do this in a clinic. There's like far more than I can ever cover in a single office visit. And I kind of need to be with this person for an extended period of time to help them through this. So develop those resources and slowly move from doing more of that and less of the one-on-one time in clinical practice. And then so that led to the other book, and that community continues to grow. And I also have I started another business a few years ago that's completely unrelated to migraines. It's a neuroscience-based music instruction. So I'm also a musician and identify as a banjo player primarily, but started that online business several years ago, and that has grown considerably since then. And this was initially something that I was doing. I'd wake up a couple hours early before work and would work on it. And it continued to grow and grow, and to the point where that allowed me the flexibility to, pursue that more and more. So
you have a new book out. You have a new book out, right?
I have. So the last book that I released was the Keto for Migraine, and the audiobook version of that just released last week.
I can't wait to get it. Sign me up. Sign me up. I read it. I'm sure Kristen's already read it, but
yes. I honestly, I knew the Migraine Miracle, obviously, and
Right.
I didn't realize until recently you had a second book. So
Yeah.
yeah, I was super excited about that. And then you're also president for this group I recently joined called Physicians for Ancestral Health. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm excited to have you. And if there are other doctors in the low carb sphere listening, it would be a great organization for you to look into. But that is a group of doctors who are trying to spread the message of ancestral health, which basically just means that we think the most powerful lens for understanding human health and understanding why we get sick is to look at our evolutionary history and to understand the ways in which our present environment is mismatched with that. And that's our most powerful tool for understanding disease and intervening. And so that organization started several years ago. It out of the there's an annual Ancestral Health Symposium, and then that became a spinoff, and it has grown over the years. And earlier this year, I took over as president of that organization. And our main thing we do is we meet every January for our winter retreat, where we all give talks and presentations and hang out with each other. And it's really a super great time and way different than any other medical conference that you've ever been to. And so it's really been great for folks who you're out there practicing like me. When I first made this transition, I'm like, I'm on an island. Nobody else, none of my colleagues understand what I'm talking about or what I'm doing, but here's this thing I know is so amazingly powerful, and you feel alone and lost. And then when I discovered the organization, I was like, oh, here are my people, and that's a great feeling. And so being able to go to a conference where you just feel like you're in with your people is really great. So if there are doctors out there who want to check it out, we're at ancestraldoctors.org.
That's really awesome. Listen, I can't thank you enough. It's like I can go for a whole nother hour, and I'm sure Kristen's got like a million questions I just cut her off on.
No, I know. I want to be respectful of your time, but yeah, you're a wealth of information, and I know a lot of our listeners are going to benefit from this podcast, and hopefully will tune into your podcast specific for migraines, which I recently just learned about, and I'm really excited to catch up on some episodes of that as well. So thank you so much for coming on. It was a great time, great conversation.
Yeah, you bet. I really enjoyed talking to you guys.
Guys, check out the book from 2012, Migraine Miracle, and then his new book, Keto for Migraines, which I will be getting on audiobook actually right now. I'm going to use my credit right now.
You get to hear my voice some more.
Sounds like you're doing amazing work. And thank you for taking your time out and coming out here. And just, it's so reinvigorating to have a physician, entrepreneur, author, cutting edge doctor, world-renowned expert. It just makes me really excited about our profession, that there's people like you and Kristen and Brian and, all these people, Philip Ovadia, Andy Fung, Jason, obviously, look, we can go on and on, all the giants that have helped this field, Jason Fung, Tim Noakes, Gary Fedke. We don't say it enough, and all the scientists that have supported us and continue to do so, specifically in migraines. DiLorenzo has been so crucial in getting that research out. So it's thank you for everything that you do. And
you bet. Yeah, awesome.
We're good. Wait, did I stop it? Oh no, Jack, edit that.